When 12-year-old twins Zoraya and Kalasa Monroe started at their new school, they expected the usual challenges of fitting in. But when their history teacher, Mrs. Graves, begins targeting them with sharp remarks and public humiliation, the sisters uncover a pattern of mistreatment that goes far beyond them. Armed with courage, a silent ally, and the determination to fight for justice, they ignite a movement that threatens to unravel the reputation of the school's most respected teacher, proving that even the smallest voices can bring the greatest changes. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the sleepy town of Lake Ridge, where Zoraya and Kalasa Monroe stood outside their new school, clutching their backpacks nervously. The twins, with their radiant brown skin and tightly coiled hair neatly tied back, exchanged a glance of mutual reassurance. Their mother, Amara, had moved the family to this town for a fresh start, hoping the small community would provide stability and opportunity. But as Zoraya and Kalasa gazed at the imposing brick building in front of them, they couldn't shake the nerves bubbling in their stomachs. The first day at a new school always carried a mix of excitement and anxiety, but for Zoraya and Kalasa, it felt heavier. They were used to being the new kids, and they knew what it meant to stand out, especially in a place where most of the faces they'd seen so far looked nothing like theirs. Taking a deep breath, they pushed through the school's double doors and entered the bustling hallways. The chatter of students filled the air, and lockers slammed shut in rhythmic bursts. The twins walked in silence, clutching the paper schedules their mother had printed for them that morning. They found their way to the main office, where a stern-looking secretary greeted them with a neutral smile and handed over official schedules. "You'll be in Mrs. Graves' homeroom," the secretary said, pointing down the hallway. "Room 204, second door on your left." Zoraya and Kalasa thanked her politely and made their way to the classroom. The hallway felt endless, each step heavier as their nerves grew. When they reached the door, Zoraya hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the classroom buzzed with pre-class chatter. Students sat in clusters, laughing and passing notes. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Graves, a tall, stern woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her piercing eyes immediately landed on the twins as they entered. The room quieted as Mrs. Graves raised her hand for silence. "Class," she began, her tone brisk and commanding, "we have 2 new students joining us today. Ladies, please stand so everyone can see you." Zoraya and Kalasa exchanged a quick glance before standing. They both felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them. "This is Zoraya and Kalasa Monroe," Mrs. Graves continued. "Let's give them a warm welcome." Her tone lacked warmth, and there was no applause, only a few muffled giggles from the back of the room. Mrs. Graves added, almost as an afterthought, "Adjusting to a new school can be challenging, but I'm sure you'll manage, in time." Zoraya clenched her fists discreetly under her desk. Kalasa looked down, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The teacher moved on, starting the lesson without giving them a second glance. As the class progressed, Mrs. Graves dove into a lecture about the American Revolution. She called on several students to answer questions, and each time, she offered encouragement or a guiding hint. But when she called on Kalasa, her tone was less forgiving. "Kalasa," she said, her voice sharp, "what year did the Revolutionary War end?" Kalasa hesitated, trying to recall the exact date from her previous school's history class. 1783, she ventured. Mrs. Graves arched an eyebrow. "Barely correct," she said with a smirk. "Maybe if you paid more attention, you'd answer with more confidence. Or do they not teach history where you're from?" The room fell silent. A few students snickered, but most looked uncomfortable. Zoraya shot her sister a glance, her eyes burning with indignation. She opened her mouth to defend Kalasa but stopped herself, worried it might make things worse. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Zoraya and Kalasa quickly gathered their things and left the room without looking back. They walked silently down the hall until they reached their lockers. "That wasn't okay," Zoraya finally said, breaking the heavy silence. Kalasa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, but what can we do? She's the teacher. Zoraya's jaw tightened. We'll figure something out, she said firmly. She can't treat us like this. At lunch, the twins sat at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, far from the noisy clusters of other students. Occasionally, someone glanced their way, but no one approached. Zoraya stared at her tray of untouched food, her mind racing with thoughts about Mrs. Graves and how unfair the morning had been. We'll show them we belong here, Zoraya said, breaking the silence. Kalisa nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. The first day was supposed to be a fresh start, but it felt like they'd been thrown into a battle they hadn't asked for. The second day of school began with a cautious optimism for Zoraya and Kalisa. They decided to put the previous day behind them and focus on their classes. Their mother, Amara, had always told them, don't let one bad moment define you. Prove them wrong with your actions. Holding on to that advice, the twins walked into the school building with their heads held high. Their first class of the day was history with Mrs. Graves. Although the memory of her dismissive attitude still lingered, they resolved to remain calm and focused. As the students filed in, Mrs. Graves stood at the front, flipping through her notes. Her cold eyes briefly glanced at the twins but offered no acknowledgement. The lesson began with a pop quiz. Mrs. Graves handed out sheets of paper, and the room filled with the sound of pencils scratching. Zoraya and Kalisa worked diligently, determined to prove their capabilities. Zoraya, who loved history, was confident in her answers, while Kalisa took her time, carefully considering each question. When the quiz ended, Mrs. Graves collected the papers and began grading them immediately. The class waited in silence as she marked each sheet, her red pen moving briskly. After several minutes, she looked up with an expression that made Zoraya's stomach sink. Well, class, Mrs. Graves began, holding up a paper, it seems not everyone is prepared for the rigors of my class. Some students may need to work much harder if they hope to succeed here. Her eyes landed directly on Zoraya and Kalisa. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she held up Kalisa's quiz for everyone to see. This, she said, tapping the paper with her pen, is what happens when you don't take your education seriously. Barely half of these answers are correct. Kalisa's cheeks burned as the class erupted into whispers and muffled laughter. She sank lower in her seat, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Zoraya felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. That's not fair, Zoraya said, her voice trembling but steady. Mrs. Graves raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? It's not fair to single her out like that, Zoraya continued. You didn't show anyone else's paper. The room fell silent. Some students exchanged surprised glances, while others waited to see how Mrs. Graves would react. The teacher's lips thinned into a tight line. I will not tolerate disrespect in my classroom, she said coldly. If you have something to say, Zoraya, perhaps you'd like to join your sister at the front of the room and demonstrate your knowledge to the class. Zoraya hesitated but refused to back down. She stood up and walked to the front, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Graves handed her a piece of chalk and pointed to the blackboard. Let's see if you can answer this, she said, writing a question about the causes of the Civil War. Zoraya took a deep breath and wrote her answer with as much confidence as she could muster. When she finished, she stepped back, waiting for Mrs. Graves' response. The teacher read the answer, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to the class and said, well, it's adequate. But I would have expected more detail. Sit down, Zoraya. As Zoraya returned to her seat, the humiliation lingered in the air. Mrs. Graves continued the lesson as if nothing had happened, but Zoraya and Kalisa could feel the weight of the other students' stares. By the time the bell rang, the twins were the first to leave the classroom. They walked down the hallway in silence until they reached their lockers. She hates us, Kalisa finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's trying to break us, Zoraya replied, her fists clenched. But we won't let her. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The twins tried to focus on their other classes, but the incident in history class replayed in their minds. They felt isolated, as though a spotlight had been placed on them, making it impossible to blend in. That evening, at the dinner table, their mother immediately noticed something was wrong. Amara put down her fork and looked at her daughters with concern. "What happened?" she asked gently. Kalasa hesitated, but Soraya spoke up. "It's Mrs. Graves. She's targeting us. Today she embarrassed Cal in front of the whole class and then made me stand up and answer a question just to humiliate me too." Amara's expression hardened. "This isn't right," she said firmly. "No teacher has the right to treat my daughters this way. We're going to address this." Zoraya and Kalasa exchanged a glance. They trusted their mother, but they also knew this was just the beginning of a battle they hadn't asked for. The following morning, Zoraya and Kalasa walked into school with a renewed sense of determination. After their conversation with their mother, they felt reassured that someone was on their side. Amara had promised to speak with the school administration if Mrs. Graves' behavior continued, but for now, the twins resolved to handle things as best as they could on their own. When they entered the history classroom, the atmosphere felt unusually tense. The other students exchanged whispers and avoided eye contact with the twins. Zoraya noticed that even the usual chatter among classmates had died down. She nudged Kalasa. "Do you feel that?" Zoraya whispered. Kalasa nodded but didn't respond. She kept her head down, determined not to draw any attention. Mrs. Graves entered the room a few moments later, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She carried a stack of papers and placed them on her desk with a loud thud. "Today, we will continue our discussion on the Civil War," she announced, her tone as sharp as ever. "But before we begin, I have a few comments to make." Zoraya and Kalasa tensed, expecting the worst. "There has been some feedback about my teaching methods," Mrs. Graves said, her eyes sweeping the room but lingering briefly on the twins. "Let me be clear, I expect excellence from all of my students, and I will not apologize for holding you to high standards." Zoraya glanced at Kalasa, who looked as though she wanted to sink into her chair. The message was clear, Mrs. Graves was addressing them without mentioning their names. The lesson proceeded with the usual rigor. Mrs. Graves called on several students to read aloud from the textbook, carefully avoiding the twins. Zoraya noticed that her classmates seemed more subdued than usual, their voices lacking the usual confidence. It was as if everyone was walking on eggshells. Midway through the lesson, a surprising thing happened. Tia, a quiet girl who usually kept to herself, raised her hand. "Yes, Tia," Mrs. Graves said, looking slightly annoyed at the interruption. "I just wanted to ask if we could spend more time discussing the contributions of African American soldiers during the Civil War," Tia said, her voice steady but soft. "I think it's an important part of the story that we haven't covered yet." The room fell silent. Mrs. Graves hesitated, her expression hard to read. Finally, she said, "That's an interesting suggestion, but we have a lot to cover, and I don't want to get off track." Tia nodded, but the twins exchanged a quick glance. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. As the lesson ended, Tia lingered near the twins' desks while the other students filed out of the room. She approached them cautiously, her face a mix of nervousness and determination. "Hey," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say. I think what Mrs. Graves did yesterday was wrong." Kalasa looked up in surprise. "You think so?" Tia nodded. "Yeah. And I'm not the only one. A lot of us think it was unfair, but we didn't know what to do." Zoraya studied Tia's face, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Why are you telling us this now?" Tia hesitated, then pulled her phone from her pocket. "I recorded it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to at first, but when she started singling you out, I knew it wasn't right." Kalasa's eyes widened. You have a video? Tia nodded again. I don't want to cause trouble, but if you need proof, I thought, maybe this could help. Zoraya and Kalasa exchanged a look of disbelief. For the first time, they felt like they weren't completely alone. Thank you, Zoraya said earnestly. That means a lot. Tia smiled faintly. You're welcome. And if you need anything else, let me know. As Tia walked away, Zoraya and Kalasa sat in stunned silence. The idea of having concrete evidence of Mrs. Graves' behavior was both empowering and daunting. They knew it could change everything, but they also knew it might escalate the situation. By the time the lunch bell rang, the twins had made up their minds. They weren't going to let Mrs. Graves' actions go unchecked. With Tia's recording in hand, they had the strength to start fighting back. The morning after Tia had given Zoraya and Kalasa the recording, the twins sat at the kitchen table with their mother, Amara, debating their next steps. Amara had listened to the video and was visibly furious at Mrs. Graves' behavior. This isn't just unfair, it's blatant discrimination, Amara said, her voice steady but filled with anger. We're taking this to the principal. No teacher has the right to treat students like this. Kalasa hesitated, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt. What if it makes things worse? What if she finds out and retaliates? Zoraya, always the bolder of the two, shook her head. She's already treating us horribly, Kal. We can't just let her keep doing this. Amara placed a reassuring hand on Kalasa's shoulder. We'll handle this together. You're not alone in this. Later that morning, Amara accompanied the twins to the school. The principal, Mr. Lawson, a tall man with graying hair and a perpetually serious expression, greeted them in his office. He gestured for them to sit, and Amara wasted no time getting to the point. My daughters have been targeted by Mrs. Graves, and I have proof of it, Amara began, her voice firm. Mr. Lawson raised an eyebrow. Targeted? That's a serious accusation. Mrs. Graves is one of our most experienced teachers. I'm sure she is, Amara replied, her tone unwavering, but experience doesn't excuse behavior like this. She pulled out her phone and played the recording. As the audio filled the room, Mr. Lawson's expression shifted from skeptical to concerned. The recording captured Mrs. Graves' condescending comments and the pointed way she had singled out Kalasa in front of the class. When the audio ended, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This is troubling, he admitted. I had no idea something like this was happening in her classroom. Zoraya spoke up, her voice steady. She doesn't treat everyone like that, Mr. Lawson. Just us. Kalasa nodded, adding, it feels like she's trying to make us feel small, like we don't belong here. Mr. Lawson sighed heavily. I'll need to investigate this further. But I can assure you, we take these matters seriously. Amara wasn't satisfied with his vague response. Investigate? You have all the evidence you need right here. What more do you need to take action? Mr. Lawson shifted uncomfortably. There are protocols we have to follow, Mrs. Monroe. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Graves and review her side of the story. And in the meantime? Amara asked sharply. I'll ensure that your daughters feel safe and respected in their classes, he replied. Amara narrowed her eyes but nodded reluctantly. I'll hold you to that. After the meeting, the twins returned to class, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Mrs. Graves' history class was their next period, and they didn't know what to expect. When they entered the room, Mrs. Graves was already at her desk, her face as composed as ever. If she knew about the meeting with Mr. Lawson, she didn't show it. The lesson began as usual, but the twins noticed subtle differences. Mrs. Graves didn't call on them once, nor did she make any veiled comments. Zoraya leaned toward Kalasa during a quiet moment. Do you think she knows? Kalasa shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe she's just trying to cover herself. Despite Mrs. Graves' restrained behavior, the tension in the room was palpable. The other students seemed to sense that something was brewing. At lunch, Tia approached the twins at their table. "How did it go with the principal?" she asked, sitting down beside them. "He said he's going to investigate," Zoraya replied. "Whatever that means." Tia frowned. "That's it?" After hearing the recording, Kalasa nodded. "He said he has to follow protocols." "That's not right," Tia said firmly. "You shouldn't have to wait for justice." Her words resonated with the twins. They realized that while the principal might take action eventually, they couldn't rely solely on the school administration to fix things. Zoraya looked at Tia and said, "Thank you for helping us. We wouldn't even have this chance without you." Tia smiled. "I just want to do what's right. And if you need more help, I'm here." As the lunch bell rang, the twins felt a spark of hope. They had started the process of holding Mrs. Graves accountable, but they knew this was only the beginning of their fight for fairness and respect. The day after the meeting with Mr. Lawson, Zoraya and Kalasa arrived at school feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. They hadn't seen any immediate changes after presenting the recording, and the thought of facing Mrs. Graves again made their stomachs churn. When they walked into history class, Mrs. Graves was already at her desk, her face tight and her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't greet the class as she usually did, instead beginning the lesson without any pleasantries. The twins sat quietly, exchanging uneasy glances. Something about Mrs. Graves' demeanor felt off. While she didn't address them directly, her frustration was palpable. She spoke in a clipped tone, and her gaze lingered on Zoraya and Kalasa for just a moment too long when scanning the room. Midway through the lesson, Mrs. Graves paused abruptly and closed the textbook she'd been reading from. "Before we continue," she said, her voice icy, "I need to address something." The class froze. Zoraya and Kalasa instinctively straightened in their seats, their pulses quickening. "It has come to my attention," Mrs. Graves continued, "that some of you feel I've been unfair in my teaching methods. Let me make one thing clear, I have always held my students to the highest standards, and I will not apologize for expecting excellence." Her eyes swept across the room but settled briefly on the twins, making her message unmistakable. "If anyone has concerns," she added, her tone dripping with condescension, "I suggest they come directly to me rather than resorting to other methods." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Zoraya clenched her fists under her desk, her anger bubbling to the surface. Kalasa, on the other hand, kept her gaze fixed on her notebook, trying to remain invisible. Tia, sitting a few rows behind the twins, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Zoraya caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. Mrs. Graves resumed the lesson as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere in the room remained charged. The twins couldn't focus on the lecture, their thoughts consumed by Mrs. Graves' thinly veiled accusation. After class, as the students filed out of the room, Mrs. Graves called out, "Zoraya, Kalasa, a word, please." The twins froze. Zoraya shot Kalasa a look, and they reluctantly approached the teacher's desk. Mrs. Graves leaned forward, her expression stern. "I'm aware of the accusations being made against me," she said quietly, her tone cold but controlled. "And while I won't comment on them directly, I suggest you think very carefully about the consequences of your actions. A teacher's reputation is not something to be taken lightly." Kalasa's voice was barely above a whisper. "We just want to be treated fairly." Mrs. Graves narrowed her eyes. "Fairly? Life isn't fair, young lady. The sooner you learn that, the better." Zoraya stepped forward, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "We're not afraid of you, Mrs. Graves. You can't keep treating us like this." For a moment, Mrs. Graves looked taken aback, but she quickly recovered, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "We'll see about that," she said, dismissing them with a wave of her hand. The twins left the classroom, their hearts pounding. As they walked down the hall, Zoraya muttered, "She knows." And she's not going to back down easily. Kalisa nodded, her hands trembling slightly. What do we do now? We keep pushing, Zoraya replied firmly. She's trying to scare us, but we can't let her win. At lunch, the twins sat with Tia, recounting the confrontation. Tia listened intently, her brow furrowed. She's clearly trying to intimidate you, Tia said. But she wouldn't be acting like this if she didn't know she's in trouble. That's what I think, too, Zoraya said. She's panicking. Tia hesitated, then said, we need to get more people involved. If other students speak up, she won't be able to deny it anymore. Kalisa looked unsure. What if no one else wants to get involved? She's scary, Tia. And a lot of people don't want to risk getting on her bad side. Tia nodded thoughtfully. That's true. But I've heard other students whispering about how she's treated them in the past. If they see that you two are standing up to her, maybe they'll feel brave enough to do the same. The twins considered this. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew Tia was right. If they wanted to bring about real change, they couldn't do it alone. As the lunch bell rang, Zoraya looked at her sister and said, we're not just doing this for us, Kal. We're doing it for everyone she's ever hurt. Kalisa nodded, her resolve strengthening. Let's do it. With Tia by their side, the twins began to plan their next move. Zoraya, Kalisa, and Tia spent the afternoon brainstorming how to gather more support. They knew that confronting Mrs. Graves wasn't just about their experience, it was about addressing the years of similar behavior she'd likely directed at other students. We need to find other students who've had issues with her, Tia said as they huddled in the library after school. If enough people come forward, Mr. Lawson will have no choice but to take action. But how do we convince them to speak up? Kalisa asked. What if they're too scared? Zoraya leaned forward, her voice firm. We remind them that staying silent lets her keep doing this. If we work together, she can't intimidate all of us. Tia nodded. We can start with the students in our class. I've already heard a few of them whispering about how unfair she is. The next day, the trio put their plan into action. During lunch, they approached small groups of students who had witnessed Mrs. Graves' treatment of the twins. The conversation started cautiously, with many students reluctant to talk. She's always been strict, but I don't think she likes certain people, admitted Devon, a boy who sat near the twins in history class. Why do you think that? Tia asked. She made a lot of comments last year about how I wasn't the type to succeed in her class, he said, lowering his voice. I didn't think much of it then, but now I see what she's doing to you guys, and it makes sense. Devon agreed to write a statement about his experiences, which gave the trio a boost of confidence. In the hallway, they approached another student, Mia, who had seemed uncomfortable during Mrs. Graves' recent tirades. She's definitely unfair, Mia admitted hesitantly. But I don't want to get involved. What if she finds out and makes things worse? Zoraya stepped forward. We get it, Mia. But staying quiet won't stop her. If we all stand up together, she won't be able to punish anyone. She'll have to face the truth. After a long pause, Mia nodded. Okay. I'll help. By the end of the day, Zoraya, Kalisa, and Tia had gathered statements from 5 students who were willing to share their experiences. Some were from current students, while others were from students who'd graduated but had similar stories of being unfairly targeted by Mrs. Graves. We're building a case, Tia said as they reviewed the statements in the library. If we present this to Mr. Lawson, he'll have no choice but to act. The following morning, the twins and Tia met with Mr. Lawson again. They presented the written statements, along with the recording from Tia's phone. Mr. Lawson read through the statements carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a heavy sigh. This is significant, he admitted. I can't ignore this. But I'll need to speak with each of these students individually to verify their accounts. We understand, Zoraya said. But we're not going to let this be swept under the rug. Mr. Lawson nodded. You have my word. I'll begin addressing this immediately. In the meantime, I'll make arrangements to ensure Mrs. Graves' behavior is closely monitored. As they left the office, Zoraya and Kalasa felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it seemed like their voices, and the voices of others, were being heard. That afternoon, word spread quickly among the students that Mrs. Graves was under investigation. Many students began sharing their own stories, creating a ripple effect of support for the twins and others who had been mistreated. She's not untouchable anymore, Tia said with a smile as they walked to their next class. Zoraya nodded. We're not finished yet, but we're closer than ever. Kalasa, who had been quieter throughout the process, finally smiled. It's not just us anymore. We're not alone. The trio walked into history class with their heads held high, ready to face whatever came next. The investigation into Mrs. Graves' behavior was moving faster than anyone had expected. Mr. Lawson had interviewed several students who had provided written statements, and it was clear that the issue could no longer be ignored. The twins and Tia noticed that whispers about Mrs. Graves were spreading throughout the school, and the air in the hallways felt electric with anticipation. For Mrs. Graves, the tension was visible. She carried herself with her usual stern demeanor, but her movements were sharper, her tone harsher, and her gaze lingered on the twins with unmistakable resentment. The twins' history class that day felt heavier than ever. Mrs. Graves barely acknowledged the students as they entered, and she started the lecture without her usual command of the room. Even her staunchest defenders among the students were unusually quiet. Halfway through the lesson, the classroom door opened, and Mr. Lawson stepped in, accompanied by another teacher. The room froze. Mrs. Graves, Mr. Lawson said, his tone calm but firm, may I have a word with you outside? Mrs. Graves stiffened. I'm in the middle of a lesson, Mr. Lawson. This won't take long, he replied, motioning toward the hallway. Her jaw tightened, but she followed him out. The other teacher stayed behind, taking her place at the front of the room. The students sat in stunned silence, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Zoraya and Kalasa didn't say a word, but their hearts were pounding. They didn't know what was being said outside, but they could feel that the moment they'd been waiting for was finally happening. Mrs. Graves returned to the classroom 10 minutes later, her face pale but composed. Without saying a word, she gathered her materials, handed a stack of papers to the substitute teacher, and walked out of the room. The substitute, a younger and friendlier teacher, addressed the class. I'll be taking over for today. Please turn to Chapter 6 in your textbooks. The rest of the class passed uneventfully, but the students couldn't focus. Everyone whispered quietly, trying to piece together what had happened. Zoraya and Kalasa remained quiet, exchanging glances of nervous anticipation. At the end of the day, Mr. Lawson called Zoraya, Kalasa, and Tia to his office. They sat nervously as he closed the door and took a seat across from them. First, I want to thank all three of you for your courage, Mr. Lawson began. It takes a lot to speak up, especially when it's against someone in a position of authority. Kalasa's voice was soft but steady. What's going to happen to Mrs. Graves? Mr. Lawson folded his hands on the desk. Mrs. Graves has been placed on administrative leave while we finalize our investigation. Based on the evidence and the testimonies we've received, I don't expect her to return to teaching here. Zoraya felt a wave of relief, but she wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. What about the students she hurt? Will anything be done for them? Mr. Lawson nodded. We're implementing new training for all staff to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. And we'll be holding a meeting with students and parents to address these issues openly. Tia spoke up, her voice strong. It's not just about fixing the school. People need to know this isn't okay anywhere. Mr. Lawson gave her a small smile. You're right. And I believe your actions have set an example for others to follow. When the twins and Tia left the office, they were greeted by several students who had been waiting outside. Devon, Mia, and a few others approached them with smiles and words of encouragement. "You did it," Devon said, clapping Zoraya on the shoulder. "We all did it," Zoraya replied, looking around at the group. "It wasn't just us." Kalasa, who had been quieter throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. "Thank you. All of you. We couldn't have done this without your support." The group lingered in the hallway, exchanging stories and laughter. For the first time since arriving at the school, Zoraya and Kalasa felt a sense of belonging. That evening, when the twins got home, Amara greeted them with open arms. "I heard the news," she said, pulling them into a hug. "I'm so proud of you both." "It wasn't just us, Mom," Zoraya said. "We had help." "That's what makes it even better," Amara replied. "You didn't just stand up for yourselves, you stood up for others, too." Kalasa smiled, a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt like things were finally going to be okay. The week after Mrs. Graves was placed on leave, the atmosphere at school changed dramatically. The tension that had once hung over the history classroom was gone, replaced with a sense of relief. The substitute teacher, Ms. Carter, was warm and approachable, and the students quickly adapted to her style. For the first time in weeks, Zoraya and Kalasa entered the classroom without a pit in their stomachs. As Ms. Carter began the lesson, she made it clear that her classroom would be a safe space for everyone. "I want all of you to feel heard and respected," she said with a smile. "If you have questions, concerns, or even just ideas, my door is always open." Zoraya and Kalasa exchanged a glance. It felt like a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. During lunch, the twins and Tia sat with Devon, Mia, and a few other students who had supported them throughout the ordeal. The group was livelier than usual, laughing and joking as they shared stories about Ms. Carter's engaging teaching methods. "I can't believe how different the class feels now," Devon said, shaking his head. "It's like a whole new subject." "That's because we're not walking on eggshells anymore," Zoraya replied. Kalasa nodded. "And it's not just about the class. It's about knowing we stood up for ourselves, and for each other." Tia grinned. "You two are officially legends now. People are talking about what you did, even outside of school." The twins smiled, their cheeks flushing with a mixture of pride and modesty. They had never sought attention or recognition, but knowing their actions had made a difference filled them with a quiet sense of accomplishment. That afternoon, Mr. Lawson called an all-school assembly to address the events of the past few weeks. The auditorium buzzed with chatter as students and teachers filed in, curious about what the principal would say. When Mr. Lawson stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He began by acknowledging the situation with Mrs. Graves, carefully choosing his words to balance transparency with professionalism. "As you all know, we recently faced a difficult situation involving one of our teachers. While I cannot discuss the specifics, I want to emphasize that our priority is creating an environment where every student feels respected and valued." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "I also want to commend the students who had the courage to come forward. Their bravery has helped us make important changes that will benefit everyone." Zoraya and Kalasa sat in the front row, their hearts swelling with pride as Mr. Lawson's words resonated through the auditorium. After the assembly, Amara met the twins in the hallway. She had taken the afternoon off to attend the event, and her face radiated pride as she hugged them tightly. "You two have done something incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown everyone that standing up for what's right can make a difference." "It wasn't just us, Mom," Kalasa said. "It was everyone who helped us, like Tia and the other students." Amara smiled. "That's even better. You've created a ripple effect. And I know this is just the beginning for you both." In the weeks that followed, the school implemented several new initiatives, including diversity training for staff and an anonymous reporting system for students to share concerns about unfair treatment. Zoraya and Kalasa became unofficial ambassadors for the changes, helping other students feel empowered to speak up. Their bond with Tia and the other students who had supported them grew stronger, and their once lonely lunches turned into lively gatherings filled with laughter and friendship. One afternoon, as the twins walked home together, Kalasa turned to Zoraya with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we really made a difference?" she asked. Zoraya smiled. "Look around, Cal. Everything feels different now. People are standing up for each other, and the school actually feels like a place where we belong. We didn't just make a difference, we started something bigger." Kalasa nodded, a contented smile spreading across her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. As they reached their house, Amara was waiting on the porch, waving them inside for dinner. The twins knew that their journey wasn't over, but they also knew they had the strength, support, and courage to face whatever challenges came next. The ending of this story is a satisfying and uplifting conclusion that balances realism with hope. It acknowledges that systemic issues, like discrimination and power dynamics, aren't solved overnight, but it highlights the impact of collective action and courage. The twins, Zoraya and Kalasa, represent resilience and the power of standing up for justice, even when it feels daunting or dangerous. The conclusion also avoids a simplistic happily ever after narrative. Instead, it offers a meaningful resolution where the school takes steps to address the issue, and the twins grow from the experience, both individually and within their community. Their friendship with Tia and the support from their peers demonstrate how solidarity can amplify change, while the role of their mother, Amara, underscores the importance of family and adult advocacy in navigating such challenges. What I find particularly compelling about the ending is its focus on empowerment. It doesn't just celebrate the twins' victory over Mrs. Graves but also emphasizes the ripple effect of their actions. They inspire others to speak up, create a safer environment for future students, and ultimately shift the school's culture toward accountability and inclusivity. Overall, the ending serves as a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of deeply ingrained prejudice, and that bravery, combined with community support, can lead to meaningful progress. It leaves the reader with a sense of hope and the understanding that every voice, no matter how small it seems, has the power to make a difference.